Last week on Easter Sunday, we started with this verse from 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 17, where Paul kind of introduces this topic. He says there, "Now, in giving this instruction, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse." And we talked about the reality of how possible it is for people within religious circles, church circles, to exist in a way that is more to the detriment of the people who are involved in it than it is actually a benefit, which obviously is completely backwards from the way it ought to be. And so our heart's desire, hopefully those of us who are part of this faith community, is to ensure that what we're doing and how we're being and how we're going about living within this church community and as a church community, that it's not like Paul accuses the church in Corinth with, that when we gather together, it is in fact for the better and not for the worse. So today we're going to kind of dive in a little deeper into the actual significance of what was occurring within the church of Corinth, especially around this thing called the Lord's Supper, as many of us have come to call it, or you may hear the word communion, or some of you might have grown up with a tradition of celebrating the Eucharist, okay? And so whatever the terminology may be, they all have something to do with what Paul talks about here in the remainder of this chapter. So let me just read a few verses. I want to make some comments and then also raise a couple of questions that I think naturally come to the surface and see if we can maybe find some answers to those questions, albeit in a very, very limited amount of time that we have to do this. Like one thing we have to understand when we're talking about communion, which we're not going to really get into this. You can look it up, but there are some faith traditions that hold communion as a sacrament, and there are others that hold it as an ordinance. Now, what's the difference between those two things? Well, if you want, you can ask that question on Slido, and I'll answer it later on this week. I'm not really going to get into it right now. How you like that, huh? That's right. That's a softball right there for you all. But yeah, and so, I mean, there's like so much of a church's culture, for some traditions, it really revolves and centers on this kind of aspect of worship, where, you come to church here, you'll find out that we have communion maybe once a month. I mean, we try, like the first Sunday of every month is the Sunday that we do it. I grew up in a church that did the same thing. I mean, not that there's anything magical about the first Sunday of the month. I guess it's just so people know that it's coming and they can expect it. But yeah, it definitely doesn't have or sit as kind of the centerpiece of our gathering time, where, you go to a Catholic Mass, for instance, and you're going to find that, that is really kind of the pinnacle of that worship gathering. Anyway, so Paul says, as he goes on into his talk here, he says, for to begin with, right? So, like, listen, when it comes to the matter that when you gather together, it is for the worse and not for the better. For to begin with, he says, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and in part, I believe it. Indeed, it is necessary that there be factions among you. Notice I underline that word, factions among you, so that those who are, and I underline this as well, approved may be recognized among you. So Paul here, he describes the fact that there is, in that first verse, divisions within the church. And then he says, it is by necessity that there are factions among you, which ought to sound kind of strange, especially given the fact that Paul had spent a great deal of the early part of his letter denouncing the church, criticizing the church for the dissension, for the lack of unity, for these various factions that they had within their church. What Paul seems to be suggesting here is not that a church ought to have factions, right, as it might appear to be read in our English versions, but I think what Paul is getting at is the fact that he knew what Jesus knew, and he knew what Jesus taught when it came to the matter of people as a whole and the distinction between among those people, those who are truly following after Christ and those who are not. What Christ knew, what Jesus knew, and what Jesus taught was that there's a future judgment when everything is going to be revealed. But for right now, right, like for in this particular time and era in which we live, there are always going to be those who are truly following Christ and seeking his kingdom. And then alongside of those, there are also going to be others who appear to be doing so, but are actually imposters and frauds. If you think of some of the teachings that we read from Jesus in the Gospels, perhaps what he told us about the sheep and the goats may come to mind, right? Jesus paints this picture of how in the final judgment, all of the people will be gathered together, and they will be divided between those who are the sheep and those who are the goats. And both of them are going to have professed that they knew Jesus and that they served him properly. But Jesus is going to demonstrate that while one group certainly did and was authentic in both their belief and their practice as followers of Jesus, there were going to be others who neglected what they were responsible for in the way of living out the gospel. And so the judgment for these two categories of people are going to be different. Jesus, in another place, he talked about, used this parable of the wheat and the tares, how there is in this field good and healthy wheat that is growing up. But among that wheat, there are also these tares. And the question comes, should we go and should we weed out the tares? And Jesus, in this parable, he says, no, because if we weed out the tares, it may be that we also pull out some of the wheat at the same time. No, let them both grow up together. And then in the end, when everything is revealed, the wheat and the tares will be separated. Jesus said that in the last days, it will be like it was in the days of Noah. Jesus talks about the return of the Son of Man. And he says, when the Son of Man comes, referring to himself, when Jesus ultimately comes to fulfill and finalize the judgment of all the earth, he says, the condition of the world at that time is going to be as it was in the days of Noah. He describes how there will be two working in the field, and one is taken and the other is left. And so Jesus often talked about, and this is not a very popular thing in churches today, but Jesus often talked about the reality of judgment, that judgment is sure and that it will come. So Paul here, he says that it is to be expected that within the church, there are going to be those who have professed and perhaps even aligned themselves with those who are truly following Christ. But then there are going to be those who have been tested and found to be genuine, right? That's why Paul uses this word describing those who have been approved. The idea is that there are those who have been evaluated by God and have found to be approved, and they will be recognized, which tells us that what was invisible before will be made visible. The lesson for us is that what is happening in the church in Corinth is wicked. Like when it comes to, and we haven't really gotten to it yet, but when it comes to the way that they were, the way of their being, both their culture and their practice, like we talked a little bit about last week, there was a wicked way in which they were gathering together as a church. But Paul says while there was a wickedness toward the kind of culture that was being allowed within the life of the church, it also wasn't, unfortunately, it wasn't surprising. It wasn't surprising. Now, we hear all the time of various things coming out about a church that, I talked about this last week, a church that maybe was just really kind of on the rise, right? And considered to be the kind of model that every other church should go after. Some of you are familiar with the movement of Willow Creek Association, for instance, right? And Willow Creek became this just incredible phenomenon in the United States of a church that just absolutely blew up and had among its adherents, tens of thousands of people. And then other churches and church leaders would flock to Willow Creek to find out, what's the magic sauce? How did you do that, right? Because, after all, who wouldn't want to have a church? If you're a pastor, who wouldn't want to have a church that is attracting not scores of people and not hundreds of people, but thousands and thousands of people? Who doesn't want that kind of platform? And so many fell into this trap of trying to figure out how another church did it, how another church made it. And you find out in recent years that behind the curtains of all this incredible stuff that seemed to be going on and all of this way of being that seemed like, oh man, this is how you do church in the 21st century, you find out that there was scandal and there was abuse, there was toxicity, there were the kinds of things going on that were not only being done, but that were being tolerated, oftentimes swept under the rug, hidden from ordinary view. And it's that kind of thing that Paul recognizes is a wickedness that the church cannot put up with. But for as much as the possibility of that exists, Paul points out it's not surprising. There are some who are showing who they really are by virtue of what they are doing, right? This is what was going on in the church in Corinth. The people were, their true colors were coming out in the way they were actually treating one another. You wonder, well, how can something like that exist? How can something like that go on? Well, religious spaces have sometimes figured out ways to do one of two things when it comes to the way people tend to mistreat one another. One is to just simply hide what's going on, right? To know of something that is going on and to hide it. And so obviously those who are perpetrating the wickedness, they're going to do everything they can to hide it. Sometimes others who are empowered maybe to speak up or to do something about it, they too, right, for the sake of the institution sometimes. Who wants to be part of a church that's going to end up in the news, that's going to be part of a headline, that's going to just become the new poster child for everything that's wrong with the church or with Christianity? Who wants to be a part of that? And so there's this temptation sometimes that people yield to just hide it. The other thing that sometimes happens is that it's accepted, it's tolerated, it becomes the norm for those who are actually given the power to continue in that. In the case of the Corinthians, as we're going to find out here, the problem was that when it came to the social circumstances of each individual who was part of this church, the rich were abusing the poor. And the rich were allowed to continue to abuse the poor because the rich had the means to do so. And so what happens is the rich just kind of stuck together, stood shoulder to shoulder, circled the wagons, and ultimately those who were on the margins and were disenfranchised were left. And Paul describes this practice, this culture, this way of being as wicked. Now, in verse 20, Paul says, when you come together then, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. And so we have to imagine that for their gatherings in particular, communion or the Lord's Supper seemed to have been a pretty substantial part of their time together. But Paul says here that whatever they were coming together for, it was not the Lord's Supper. That's not actually what was taking place. They could have put a sign out front, a big banner that said, hey, the Lord's Supper is served here. But Paul would have said, you may have a supper going on. I'll tell you one thing, it's not the Lord's Supper. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, he could have meant that their purpose for coming together was for something else. How many gather in Christian spaces, religious spaces, church kinds of spaces, but they ultimately gather for a purpose that is not really the purpose for which we ought to be gathering. So it could have been that, or it could have been that the effect of their coming together, the way they were coming together, what it did was it negated whatever meaning and benefit the Lord's Supper was intended to have. That is, there was this particular religious rite that was supposed to be meaningful, was supposed to have some intent and purpose behind it, but all of that was thrown away. All of it was just discarded because of the way they were gathering. Like there was no redeeming quality to the Lord's Supper. It was rendered meaningless because of the abuses that were going on in the church. And so it may have had the look of the Lord's Supper, but they were actually failing to practice it. The implication for us is that we have to ask ourselves, what is the significance of our coming together? Again, we don't do it in exactly the same way, but we do gather. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is the significance of that? What may be some of the ways that we miss the point of this? Not only on Sunday mornings, but other times that we gather together, or just other ways that we live with each other and do ministry and exist within the broader culture of our community. What are some of the kinds of, Paul here at the end of this letter, we won't read it, but you look at the end of the chapter, he says, essentially, all right, well, that's enough for now. When I come, I'll have more instructions for you, right? And so this is, he says here, he starts out this whole thing by saying, for one thing, and then he's like me, he just kind of goes on and on and on, and then he never gets to the other things. He's like, you know what, we'll save that for when I'm actually there. And so we have to realize that there are all kinds of things about us that deserve our evaluation. Not my evaluation solely, not the evaluation of merely those who are within leadership. I mean, we see there's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's unfortunate and sad, but then ultimately gets redeemed for beauty in the book of Acts, this story of how this church that is just like firing on all cylinders and just going after it and wrecking the world, right? Like, I mean, it was this train just off the tracks of wrecking the world at the time. Miracles were being performed, all these just incredible manifestations of God's power in the various communities where God was working, right? But then we come across this story where, some people kind of like, come up to the leadership of the church and they're like, hey, I don't know if you're aware of this, but like all the widows are being neglected. Like, we've got widows here in the church community and they're not being taken care of, right? And it's like, all the preachers, for whatever reason they didn't understand, they didn't know that this was going on. And so the way that we are as a church, it deserves all of our constant and sober and determined evaluation and correction. Listen, I said it a gazillion times, I'm going to say it a gazillion times more. This place isn't perfect. Organizationally speaking, we're not perfect. We're never going to be that, but that doesn't mean that we don't strive for ultimately living out to the best and highest degree possible the purposes that God has for our church. So then Paul goes on, he says, for at the meal, right? So now just imagine, like at this meal, each one eats his own supper. So one person is hungry while another gets drunk. Again, like what we have going on here is a gathering of people from widely disparate social backgrounds, right? People who are really, really well off and people who are dirt poor. People who have enough to gourd themselves on when it comes to the food that they have access to, and others who literally have nothing, right? And so Paul says one person is hungry while another gets drunk, right? He's just kind of describing the extremes here, the excess of one who is eating more than they're full, drinking so much to the point of drunkenness, and another is starving. He says, don't you have homes in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God? Do you despise this thing that is going on, this thing that is? Do you despise it in such a way that you would humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I praise you? I do not praise you in this matter. For, and here he kind of goes into what we sometimes use as a text for how we conduct the communion service. He says, "For I received from the Lord," that is the Lord Jesus, "what I also passed on to you." And so this tradition of observing the Lord's Supper was clearly already very much in practice within the churches. This letter was written most likely before any of the Gospels perhaps had been written and finalized and circulated all over the place, where we actually kind of read the narrative of the Last Supper. But the practice within the church was already very much a significant thing. And so Paul says, "I received from the Lord what I've also passed on to you." They made this a practice within the churches that were being established. He said, "On the night when Jesus was betrayed, the Lord took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way also he took the cup after supper and said, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" Now, we're not going to get into it this morning, but there is an incredible amount of what we would call ecclesiastic practices, right? That is like the practices of various churches with regards to communion and how they understand what is going on in this thing. And we're not going to get into all of that. Again, the various faith traditions that you may have grown up in will have different understandings of what is occurring at the time that we are having the Lord's Supper together. But in broad categories, let us ask this question. What's the point? What is the point of communion? I think that's a good way for us, just at least at a surface level, to understand a little more the significance of the Lord's Supper or communion. What is the point of communion? Is it, one, to dispense grace? Some of you may have grown up in a tradition where you were taught that the practice of receiving the elements of the bread and the wine was that it dispensed a measure of God's grace into your life. And so this would be the kind of tradition we would call sacramental. That is that there is this belief that there are certain things that we do as people who are following Jesus to continue to receive sort of dispensations of grace from God, right? That as frail and weak human beings, right, who are prone to wander, prone to sin, prone to all these things, what we need to have this continual sort of revival with God, where we experience God giving us grace. Sort of like in the same way that we consume food. When my body is hungry and calls for food, I can go and I can attend to that need. Well, so it is spiritually speaking. We have this spiritual need of being renewed, and one of the ways in which we are renewed is through the various sacraments that God has given to the church. And so this is why it is so important and so essential for some faith traditions to every single week, like at a Mass, if you're Roman Catholic, for instance, to go to Mass and to receive the elements. Because what is happening, what is occurring at that moment, is God is dispensing his grace into your life, which is necessary as you're pursuing your salvation. Now, that's different from what we would teach here. And it's not that there isn't a measure of grace that we can experience, but from a theological perspective, we wouldn't sort of call this a kind of one-for-one type of thing where, I have taken in this element and now God has, in some mysterious way, dispensed grace into my life or, sort of banked something inside of me. One of the problems with this kind of taking the Lord's Supper this way is that, and this may seem obvious to everybody, but it makes some kind of middleman necessary when it comes to your relationship with God and to your ongoing spiritual life, right? So those that are given to this particular faith tradition understand that it's necessary, first of all, to go to a place where the Mass is being observed and ultimately being officiated by somebody who is empowered to do so. And so, to me, it seems like from a broader biblical perspective of what it means to be a Christian, is that it vests too much power into the religious hierarchy of the church. We rather would believe in the priesthood of all believers, that every single person here who is a follower of Jesus has direct and unmitigated access to God. Tyler, a few moments ago, he read a passage about entering into this, like the throne room of God, right? Well, that's made possible because of our direct access to God. I don't need a mediator to stand between me and the Lord. Neither do you. And so that's one of the kind of issues that comes with the sacramental theology, and there are some others. Well, what about some churches would hold that there's at least some kind of mystical experience of Christ's real presence that the worshiper gets to experience at the moment that they're receiving the Lord's Supper. Is that what's going on? As we partake of the cracker and the juice or the wine, whatever happens to be being served at the church service you're at, there are some that would teach that in those emblems, Christ's real presence is there. And again, we can't really get into the nitty-gritty of all that, but that seems problematic when one of the things that we want to emphasize is the reality of God's presence constantly with us. And that, while there's a way in which, like, sometimes we're in spaces where we feel God's presence more maybe than other spaces. Like, you might come together when you come together at church on Sunday morning, it's just like, this is the time that you would kind of point to over the course of your week where it's like, this is where I really feel God's presence. Or maybe sometime during the week when you're alone or, kind of at your favorite place in the world, and it's like, this is where I feel God's presence. We love to emphasize the reality that God is, He is the spirit being, and He's not confined to some particular place. There's nothing magical about this room. Like, literally, there's just nothing magical about it. The only thing that's magical is the fact that we're here, right? And God's Spirit lives. He resides inside of us. And so when we gather together, there's something very, very special about that, but not necessarily in particular the fact that, like, something happens within these elements of the cracker and the juice. Instead, in verse 26, I think that really points to the point of communion. Verse 26, Paul says, "For you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes." You proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. This seems to be kind of the thing that Paul really wants for the church to understand is the point of why we have the Lord's Supper in the first place. See, communion does at least a couple of things for us. For one, as an emblem, as a kind of memorial. For one, communion points backward, right? What does communion do? Well, it brings us back to the cross. It remembers the cross in particular. A church can really just go off the proper path. A Christian can just really go off the proper path when they start losing the effect of the cross, the meaning, the significance of the cross in their lives. I think Christians ought to be enamored with the cross. I think that the cross should serve not by wearing it around our necks on a chain, which, like, that does nothing for me. That means nothing for me. There's a lot of people wearing gold crosses around their necks that aren't really working too hard to follow Jesus, right? So, I mean, just like the fact that the emblem hangs around your neck or you tattoo it. Where's the best place to tattoo the cross? I don't know. But like, those things are, I'm not saying that they're bad or evil, right, necessarily, but the actual object, people ask all this, I know, this is coming up. Let me just, if you're going to put in Slido right now, why are there no crosses in the church? Don't, okay? I've answered that question 17 times already. Look it up in another podcast. If you put it in there, I'm not going to answer it. The fact that there's no cross that you can visually see here, like the point isn't the object of a cross that you can like venerate or have before you. But we should, as Christians, we ought to be enamored with the cross. The cross should have deep and profound significance for our lives, right? And so communion, what it does, it gives me an opportunity to reflect backward on the cross. Kind of like we did. Some of you were here Good Friday, right? That's this thing we do once a year where we especially, try to become more attuned to the implication of the cross in our lives. The other thing communion does is it points forward, right? Not only does it point backward, it also points forward. Paul says, in receiving communion, you proclaim what? You proclaim the Lord's death, right? That's backwards. Until when? Until he comes. What does that mean? Well, that's pointing forward to something. Not only ought Christians to be enamored with the cross, I believe Christians should be preoccupied with the Lord's return. Now, that doesn't mean waiting on a mountain. Okay, when I say we ought to be preoccupied with the Lord's return, listen, how many of you are going to see the solar eclipse somewhere tomorrow? You're going to travel several hours, got one over here. Come on, yeah, some of you nerdy people you're just afraid to admit it. My son just brought it up a couple days ago. I don't know, I might be going. I hope not. But yeah, there's a lot of wackos, right? They're going to be watching the solar eclipse, and some good people too. Okay, let me just be careful. But yeah, like so I don't mean like to be preoccupied with the Lord's return means that we, strip off all of our clothes and sell everything we have and go and wait on a mountain for Jesus to return. That's not what I'm talking about. So please don't do that. But we ought to live with a preoccupation of the return of our Lord. Again, it's a pretty significant topic in Jesus' teaching. Again, not super popular necessarily, right? Because it's loaded with warning. It's loaded with, like, be ready, be on the watch. But we ought to be preoccupied with the Lord's return. So what it does mean is we ought to be busy working for the Lord. How many of you prepared for the storm? Like you did stuff to prepare for the storm. How many of you? Yeah. How many of you did not? How many of you are like me? Yeah. My wife's like, is the generator working? Well, we'll find out, won't we? Right? We will. We'll find out. Did you get gas? I'll get it when we need it. Sure enough, I was out there Thursday at the gas station. Got there I think literally 2 minutes after the pumps went out and were no longer available. But fortunately, there were other places in Sanford to get gas, and so everything was fine. But yeah, I don't prepare for that stuff. Some of us, that's how we are spiritually, unfortunately, right? We live, instead of living, preparing for a king who's coming. I just wonder, are we more resting in what we have done and what we've accomplished for ourselves, right? So communion, it points backward, it points forward as it anticipates the cross of Christ. Now, verse 27, Paul says, so, then, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sin against the body and blood of the Lord. Oh boy, this just got real. Whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sin against the body and blood of the Lord. Again, we're about to have communion, so we better know what this means, right? Now, I grew up in a church that back then, we didn't have access to all these new translations that have come up, or churches were maybe sometimes slow to take on some of the newer kinds of translations that are very much in usage today. And so we use the King James Version. And so, this verse, the way it's translated in the Good King's English is, whoever eats or drinks unworthily. And that's, when you understand it that way, I think it ultimately points you to the wrong thing, right? It sort of suggested this idea that I could be either worthy to receive communion or unworthy to receive? How many of you grew up in a space where it's like, yeah, there's this line, and you had to like somehow determine whether or not you were worthy of it or not. Now, theologically speaking, like that kind of idea, which again, I know a lot of us probably grew up with, does incredible harm to those, especially who need communion, the communion of the body the most, right? I mean, we're proclaiming this gospel where Jesus sat with sinners, with the despised, with the lowly, the scum of the earth, everybody that all of the religious right had rejected and themselves had despised. And somehow, like, we have brought into the culture of some of our churches this idea that there is, when it comes to the Lord's Supper, there are some who are worthy of receiving it and some who are not. Now, those of you who've been here for a long time, you know that we have a practice of open communion, right? That, and a lot of times now I won't have to say this when we do it, but communion for us, it's open to everybody. Like, this is not, you don't have to go to a class or take a test or sign a piece of paper promising, that you're a good, neat, tidy Christian, right? And you got your life all in order. No, we recognize this as the Lord's table where all are welcome. We come as we are, right? And the reality is that those who are the most broken are probably most in need of the fellowship and the communion around the Lord's table. And so this kind of speaks to the church's way of being. They were the Corinthian church, they were living and acting in a way that wasn't worthy of the table of the Lord. That was the real problem. It wasn't so much that some particular individual had, a sin in their life that they hadn't repented of. And so if they didn't repent of that sin and they came and they had communion, that they were eating or drinking unworthily. That's what the King James translation seemed to kind of convey and what many of us were taught. This had something far more to do about the way the commune of the church together, the way that they were unworthy, that their practice, their culture was unworthy of the table of the Lord. The table of Christ has been, unfortunately, it's been used as a threat of eternal punishment, when the whole design was to invite and to welcome those, especially, again, who needed it the most. I mean, think about who sat at the table with Jesus when he had the Last Supper with his disciples. There were all of those who would just moments later flee and scatter and deny that they had even known him. There was one who would even go out and betray him, right? And so, the sick, the sinner, the weak. Whenever we have communion being established for those who are deemed worthy of it, then we've missed the whole point. And that kind of practice deserves the judgment of the Lord. The table of Christ is meant to affirm both who we are and who we belong to. When we fail to truly remember Christ and to eat the meal with its intended purpose, which is to proclaim salvation through the cross, and when we make it more about our individual kind of worthiness or unworthiness, we put ourselves in a place where we are, potentially guilty of spiritual malpractice, right? What the cross was intended to do was to, in the case of the Corinthian church, to eradicate and break down all of the social stigmas and all of the social barriers. That is, that everybody who gathered together, whether they were rich or poor, whether they were coming from means or had nothing, right? Wherever they happened to be in the social hierarchy, that is, whatever was going on outside of the church, none of that had any place. But as soon as the church started to allow that stuff to creep in, all of that stuff that the cross had intended to dismantle, it was guilty of spiritual malpractice. So Paul says, he goes on, he says, let a person examine himself. In this way, let him eat the bread and drink from the cup. For whoever eats and drinks without recognizing the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. This is why many are sick and ill among you, and many have fallen asleep, aka are no longer with us. If we are properly judging ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined so that we may not be condemned with the world. Now, again, this trips up a lot of people. I mean, Paul here says that now, as a result of whatever this thing is, of having received the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, it has led to, apparently, sickness and disease and even death. Like, who's ready? Like, who's ready to have the crackers and the juice now? Right? Again, like, what are the implications for us? Well, for one thing, when Paul talks about discerning the body, right? What this means is it means to recognize the body for what it is. That is, to understand what the body of Christ is, that it is this body comprised of many parts, where each person is a gift to the other. See, that's what they had failed to see. Again, in their particular case, it was easy for the rich to despise the poor and see them as unimportant and unworthy and worthless. And Paul says, no. That's a failure to discern the body. That's a failure to discern what we actually have going on here, which is that we are one singular body. Not this body that is broken up into the various factions where one faction is worth or valued at or assessed at a higher level than another one. But it's one body comprised of many parts, many members, a diversity of people from all walks of life and all kinds of experiences, all kinds of positions on the social strata of the day. And yet we are one. And every one of us is a gift to the other. Look around. Look around. What you have in the room today are members of the body of Christ, where everyone, whether it is a person of great and high esteem, right? Somebody who is looked at within the community as a mover and shaker, right? Or one who is getting things done, or one who happens to have a little more money than somebody else. Like whatever the ways in which we calibrate for the worth of a person. Like none of that belongs in the church. Like everybody stands on equal ground. Everybody's on equal footing here. Everybody, regardless of the incredible contribution they make to the church by the way of how they live their lives, how they give, right down to the one who is unable to do nothing. That means that if we had in our church right now a person who is so disabled, they had no ability to speak, they had no ability to hear or to see, they had no ability to, in all the practical ways we measure these things, contribute to the life of the church. That person, that man, that woman, that boy or that girl is a gift to the church in no less way than the preacher who gets up every Sunday morning, or the people that lead us in songs, or the people that snowblow a big old snowstorm, right? Or that work with the kids and the kids, whatever the thing, whatever the contribution has to be, we are gifts one to another. So what does it mean that some are sick and even died? Well, again, most likely, this was not Paul trying to make this one-for-one correlation between, you went ahead and ate it, and you shouldn't have, and now you have the plague, right? Or guess what? The grim reaper is on its way to your house. That's not what, Paul was not making this one-for-one. What Paul did probably, within kind of like the realm of the prophetic, was recognize that there were these two things that were not necessarily attached to one another, but that were happening, and that there was some kind of link between them, and that is that the church was guilty of all of this malpractice, and there was also this strangely high level of occurrence of sickness and death. And Paul, again, like within the prophetic space, seems to put these things together. And what we can understand for that is that all of our culture and all of our practice as a church deserves evaluation and will be evaluated, ought to be evaluated by God's word. And that if we're willing to do that, if we're willing to go through that process of evaluation ourselves, we can spare ourselves from God's judgment. Who will judge? God will. If we don't judge ourselves, then God will judge us. So what do we do with this? Just two things. Then we'll have communion and be done. What are we to do? Number one, what we need to do in light of all this is we need to remember why we gather. We need to remember why we exist as a church. What is that for? It's to proclaim the gospel. We proclaim the gospel through word and action, right? Through word and deed. And not only that, but we gather because it gives us the opportunity to be strengthened in the fellowship of God's people, which no matter what is happening in the world, this is a place where every person is on equal footing with the other. There's literally nothing that makes one person more important than another person when it comes to the body of Christ. Remember why we gather. Remember why we exist as a church. And secondly, we need to remember to examine ourselves. We need to remember that it is up to me to evaluate myself. It is up to us as a church to evaluate who we are and how we are as a church. We can ask ourselves such questions is my life reflective of one that is seeking Christ and his kingdom? Or am I a fraud? Am I using the church to some of my own personal advantage? Are there ways about who we are as we think about, look at our culture and practice as a church that actually contradict the gospel and they need to be corrected? Is the way that we come to the Lord's table actually unworthy of the Lord's table? Or is our coming together to the Lord's table, is it worthy of the Lord's table? And finally, I just say that, as I was kind of thinking about all of this, I know one of the things that I feel like we don't do well, that we've got to figure out how to incorporate into the life of our body is our failure to practice, something like lament. We got up here a few moments ago and we're singing these songs, just like rah, 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 right? And who doesn't like some rah, rah, rah music, right? Of how good the Lord is and how great everything is. But the reality is, we're sitting here today and some of us are broken. Some of us are broken so much that it's almost like we feel like we're beyond repair. My heart it feels the weight of that as we, again, not that we shouldn't be praising God for his goodness, not that we shouldn't be using our words and our song to proclaim the goodness of who God is, because he is good, but to always do that, but always keep in the void or hidden behind the view of what is going on in our gathering, the reality that there's brokenness, there's disrepair, there's trauma, there's tragedy, there's hurt. There's people that are just kind of like hanging on for dear life when it comes to their faith and their walk with Jesus. And what we need to do as a body is we need to recognize that when we come to the Lord's table, there are those who are both rich and poor. And that comes not only from a material standpoint, it comes from a spiritual standpoint as well. There are some of us who gather around the table full of God. And there are some of us who are just limping our way in, hoping to experience just a scrap of Jesus' presence. What I want for us to do is for us to all understand that we are one. We are one. We are one body. We are one body who serves one Lord. And the one who's kind of sitting on the mountaintop this morning is no better than the one who is walking through the valley of the shadow of death.